So welcome all to our two-day Draper conference on the Greater Reconstruction, American Democracy After the Civil War. This conference is being live streamed, so I must ask all our panelists and audience to refrain from any private discussion. My audiovisual team tells me that even whispered conversations can be picked up on the live stream, so you're of course welcome to go out of the room for that. I also want to welcome our audience beyond this room in the viral world. I realize that the conference is being held over the weekend of Passover and Easter, and I apologize to all those of you who cannot be here for that reason. The live stream, however, will be archived and put on YouTube for posterity to watch. So before we start, I would like to read a statement put together by the University of Connecticut's Human Rights Institute, which is it's an appropriate way to start this conference on Reconstruction. Quote, "We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the occupied territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scotticoke, Golden Hill Powgasset, and Nipmuc peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout for generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example." Now, for those of you who are staying in stores, I would also recommend visiting our Human Rights Institute. We have a wonderful public exhibition there on housing struggles by West Indian, African American, and Puerto Rican peoples in Hartford. And that exhibition was curated by Professor Fiona Bernal. I hate to draw attention to you, Fiona, but you just walked in. And her students, and it is certainly well worth seeing. It is called From Civil Rights to Human Rights. Now, the topic of Reconstruction seems to have come back into vogue on its sesquicentennial anniversary. Our current political moment has no doubt contributed to the resurgence. Why do we have monuments commemorating white supremacy and the misbegotten Southern Confederacy, and relatively few to emancipation and Reconstruction, an era which led to the creation of an interracial democracy, a legacy that we still seek to recover, uphold, and expand? Why does American democracy seem so contested and fraught today, instead of the simple linear narrative of progress that undergirds so many history textbooks? The answer, many historians have claimed, lie in studying the period of Reconstruction, when tremendous strides in the fight for racial equality gave birth to a virulent backlash that eroded the very meaning of Black freedom. How did American democracy make such progress so rapidly under the revolutionary impetus of the Civil War and emancipation? And why did that effort unravel by the end of the 19th century? Is a topic that has occupied some of our best historians, some of whom, dare I say, are gathered here for this conference. Recently, conferences, books, and even television series dedicated to Reconstruction reflect this upsurge of academic and popular interest in this period. My purpose in convening this conference is, however, not to focus on the by now well-known facts of Reconstruction, or to simply correct the historical record fashioned over decades by those who propounded the lost cause myth and the now thoroughly discredited Dunning School racist version of Reconstruction as an era of abject misrule and corruption. Instead, I hope this conference gives rise to conversations about Reconstruction that extend and challenge our conventional understandings of the period. For instance, how can we stretch the spatial and chronological boundaries of Reconstruction without losing sight of the unique and radical experiment in interracial democracy based on Black citizenship after the Civil War? Abolition democracy, W.E.B. Du Bois called it. Can we assume, or rather subsume, Reconstruction in larger frameworks that lump disparate phenomena under one overarching interpretive framework? How do we tell multiple narratives of emancipation, the meaning of Black freedom and the politics of survival, grassroots efforts at family reconstruction, gender equality, and political literacy, the unleashing of racial and sexual terror in response to freed people's aspirations, and the physical, emotional, and psychic toll that this may have taken on them? How do we connect this story at the grassroots, human level, with state formation, progressive constitutionalism, the use of law as an instrument of liberation, and politics at the highest levels? Can we equate the expansion of the federal government and the nation state to defeat slavery and enact emancipation and safeguard the human, civil, and public rights of all American citizens, including former slaves, with the brutal subjugation of the Plains Indians in the West, and see them as simply two sides of the same coin? What does the domestic and global reconstruction of white supremacy and the rise of formal American empire tell us about this period? How did the persistence of peonage, forms of unfree labor, and Chinese exclusion in the West, along with the emergence of convict lease labor and debt peonage in the so-called New South, emerge from or undermine Reconstruction? Should we, in fact, understand American Reconstruction as a transnational event? How do global issues of political economy, land, labor, the triumph of industrial capitalism, and inequality contain and define the meaning of Reconstruction? What is the proper reckoning or recompense for the legacies of slavery and the systems of racial terror, subjugation, and surveillance that became de jure in the former slave states and de facto in the nation as a whole after the protracted fall of Reconstruction? What were the modes of resistance deployed by African Americans, workers, immigrants, women, and reformers in the nadir? These issues perhaps can tell us more about the current state of American democracy and society rather than simple analogies between the past and the present. These are also extremely broad and contentious questions in the historiography of emancipation and Reconstruction, and I think we have probably assembled some of the most innovative scholars who are grappling with them today. This conference, then, is meant to open up fields of inquiry and debate rather than provide definitive answers. It is meant to stimulate an exchange between those who may not agree analytically or interpretively on all things, but may in fact still learn from one another. So I'm delighted to convene this conference at the University of Connecticut at a time when the issues surrounding the reconstruction of American democracy seem more pertinent than ever. I would also like to dedicate this conference to the memory of Amy Circuit, a freed woman in Newberry, South Carolina, murdered in cold blood by two white men on February 20th, 1868, and whose case was duly recorded in the South Carolina Freedmen's Bureau Field Office records. The case was uncovered by my superb research assistant and graduate student, Catherine Angelica, and it caught my eye. The two white men were Samuel Rudd, who worked, quote, on the premises of John G. Lifford, who accompanied him. They invaded the Circuit home in search for Amy's husband, referred to variously as Charles or Coleman Circuit. Coleman Circuit later testified that he had earlier confronted Rudd for whipping his son for being, quote, sassy to him. In the scuffle that followed, Rudd shot Amy Circuit. For their attempt to protect their son from the vestiges of slavery, Coleman Circuit would lose his freedom and Amy her life. The local white magistrate, a J.E. Peterson, known to the Bureau for being involved in many, quote, outrages against freedmen, arrested Coleman for assault. At this point, the Freedmen's Bureau's agent in Newberry intervened and arrested Rudd and Lifford for the murder of Amy Circuit. But in a few days, Coleman retracted his statement after being, quote, visited by the Rudd and Lifford families, who dropped charges of assault against him. Amy's death, he now stated, could have been, quote, accidental. It is not clear what pressure was brought to bear on Coleman, but what is clear is that the murder of Amy Circuit went unpunished. Like countless freedmen and women, she paid with her life to realize her family's freedom dreams. And the story of her death is apocryphal of the story of Reconstruction, the attempt of freed people to breathe meaning into their freedom, the attempt of the Freedmen's Bureau, a stand-in for the federal government, to intervene briefly in this miscarriage of justice, and the all too familiar reinstatement of the authority of local whites to act with impunity. We certainly cannot bring justice to Amy Circuit, but in shedding light on her case, tucked like thousands of others in the voluminous papers of the Freedmen's Bureau, we can write about what freed people had to endure in the transition from slavery to freedom and the ultimate betrayal of their freedom claims. This conference is dedicated to all the unknown Amy Circuits, whose stories, along with, in keeping with our greater Reconstruction framework, that of Native Americans, immigrants, workers, really does need to be recounted as part of the history of the greater Reconstruction. However, Reconstruction is also a moment that has left us with a political and constitutional legacy and a history of activism and resistance that would benefit all American citizens long after it was dismantled. I thought I should end in a hopeful note. I must end again, though, with thanking everyone without whose assistance this conference would simply not have come to pass. So bear with me. First, I must thank the Draper Endowment that has allowed me to think big when it comes to contributing to the intellectual life of the History Department and the university. Second, I must thank the conference and event services at the University of Connecticut, particularly the indefatigable Juliet Capsis, who I think our speakers will also attest, has handled all the logistics for this conference with unmatched efficiency and aplomb. I must thank Cara Workman for her patience and her overall supervision of this conference, and for also coming up with the wonderful menus for our conference participants. Third, I must thank Harley Erickson and Christine Balestrini for their fantastic designs on the poster, program, and website. Their work has been stellar. Fourth, I thank all my colleagues in the history department who allowed me to commandeer them to chair panels, but interestingly enough, the topics of which mostly align with their own scholarly interests. Fifth, I thank our department chair, Mark Healy, and our department administrator, Jessica Muirhead, for all their assistance. Most of all, I thank all the speakers gathered here today who were willing to come to stores, I know, at a busy time during the semester and during a holiday weekend to share their work with all of us. I am truly grateful for that. Finally, I would like to thank President Susan Herbst for all her support and encouragement. You know, when I first came to UConn, I heard a saying, UConn, where the men are men and the women are champions. Apparently, that is a reference to our women's basketball team, though I think I may have jinxed them since I came here. But in my mind, it really captures Susan's fantastic tenure at this university. I'm glad she's here to inaugurate this conference before she leaves. Susan Herbst, and let me introduce her briefly, graduated from Duke University and the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Southern California. She taught at Northwestern University for 14 years and was dean at Temple University, provost at the University of Albany, executive vice chancellor for the University System of Georgia, before assuming her position here as the president of the University of Connecticut. Besides this eminent academic career, She is a renowned scholar and author of 4 books, most recently of the acclaimed Rude Democracy, Civility and Incivility in American Politics. Hence, you can see her interest in our conference. It is with great pleasure that I invite her to inaugurate the Draper Conference on the Greater Reconstruction, American Democracy After the Civil War. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Manisha. We're really thrilled to host this wonderful conference right now. For these 2 days, we're the epicenter of the 19th century history intellectual universe. I declare. It's very cool, and I'm honored to be in the company of so many distinguished scholars at one time. Thanks so much to Manisha. She's a hurricane of intellectual energy and ideas. She conceptualized the meeting. She brings her tremendous brain power, her energy to UConn daily. In a short time, she's become really central to this place with her scholarship, her teaching, her collegiality, and her real fearless willingness to be a public intellectual in what are some pretty fraught times. So I think she's a very, very courageous person, and she's a role model to students and faculty alike, and that's a great understatement. So like so many social scientists who study contemporary politics and culture, I often regret not having trained as a historian. Of course, it's impossible to properly analyze this moment in political culture without deep reflection and analysis of America's past. And I do my best in my scholarly work, but I'm really here to learn and to make my own work better. During and right after the 2016 presidential election, like a lot of political scientists, I thought we'd snap back into some sort of normalcy, regular order, recognizable political dynamic, call it what you will. But we're wrong, obviously, as so often the case. What we've been living through these last few years is extraordinary. It's fascinating to those of us who are students of politics, but mostly it's worrisome. Even to those of us who have always known, always believed that real democracy is imperfect, it's fragile, it doesn't necessarily address inequality or injustice. And I wrote a book on civility and incivility in American politics a few years ago, and most of it seems worthless given the change we've seen just over the last few years. So it's a bit worrisome, it's a bit scary what we see going on around us, but university presidents are optimistic by nature. We have to be, forward motion. But I'm hopeful that our new politics and new normal will make us better citizens, make us better people. The students in college today are not, even though they're often glued to their iPhones and their devices, I don't find them particularly self-absorbed or cold. I think they're very social, they're very empathic, they're very outward, hence their pounding, unstoppable interest in the environment, which I feel tremendously every day. Their record-breaking public engagement. Students come to college these days ready to do work in the community, and I thank the high schools for that, because they come to us knowing that they have to give back, and I think that's something pretty new, at least in my time in higher ed. And they're generally, very sensitive, and if you look at it, I think in the wrong way, you call them overly sensitive or snowflakes, but I think the right way to look at it is that, this is the first generation that's brought up to think bullying is wrong, to believe in tolerance, inclusion, again, stuff they learned, from elementary school on. So yeah, when they come to university, they want to live out those values. And one of the things that you do and then I do is try to teach them to have a tougher skin, that they're going to have to hear things they don't like, engage in debates, so forth. But on the whole, I find them very open and very outward, and I think that's it's a wonderful thing for us. But they're not going to be the kind of citizens that we hope for without a very sophisticated understanding of American history. So I'm always pushing them, regardless of their major, to study as much history as they can, given their field. They need to understand how this particular trying moment that they feel very deeply, how it fits with our own experience in Reconstruction, the Great Depression, 1968, Watergate. all those important, certain milestone eras in American history. No matter what their ideological framework, they'll benefit greatly. So again, thanks for making the trip up. Hope it wasn't too arduous. When I first came here, I was told that Storrs was conveniently located between New York and Boston. And I have excised that from most of our literature because it's not true. That said, yeah, that's true. We love our bucolic place here, and hopefully the weather's nice enough for you to take a walk around this absolutely gorgeous campus. So thanks for making the trip up. Enjoy the conference, and I look forward to learning a lot. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone to the panel on the legal history of Reconstruction. I'm Cornelia Dayton. I'm also known as Nina. And for the purposes of this conference, I think the salient fact is that I am honored to be a faculty colleague of Manisha Sinha, an old friend, and to have her in the history department on this campus. The panelists will speak in the order listed, and they know that they're going to speak for no more than 15 minutes. They're going to save things to talk about in the Q&A with all of you. So they are in order: Pamela Brandwein, who is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan. Her fields include constitutional law, politics, civil rights, American political development. Her scholarship focuses in particular on the period we're looking at today, the Civil War and Reconstruction. She's the author of Reconstruction, the Supreme Court and the Production of Historical Truth. This is a fascinating, her first book topic for today's political environment, because it examines the institutional production and establishment of an error-ridden account of the 14th Amendment's Privileges and Immunities Clause. Her second book came out in 2011, Rethinking the Judicial Settlement of Reconstruction. And her current project examines the relationship between anti-slavery politics and capitalist development. So she will be speaking today on rethinking the judicial abandonment narrative. Our second panelist is Kate Major, who teaches history at Northwestern, has written widely on race and politics in the Civil War Reconstruction era. I want you to check out, if you already don't know it, her new edition of 1942 book that was long out of print and is a classic. I just ordered my copy this week. John E. Washington's They Knew Lincoln, which is the first book-length study of African-American specific individuals who interacted with Abraham Lincoln as president. Her current book explores the antebellum popular political mobilization that made Reconstruction possible. And she has two articles from that project forthcoming, one in the American Journal of Legal History and one in the Journal of the Civil War Era, so we can get a sense of it. And her presentation today is entitled, indeed, Anti-Slavery Origins of the Reconstruction Amendments. Our third speaker is Christian G. Samato, who teaches legal history and constitutional law at Boston University School of Law. And he has written fascinating books. I'll just name some of them. Lincoln and the 13th Amendment, Becoming American Under Fire, Irish Americans, African Americans and the Politics of Citizenship During the Civil War Era, and something that legal historians and others should check out, a documentary readings book of legal history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. He will talk to us about nation building and the law during the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And our fourth speaker is John Fabian Witt, who teaches at Yale Law School. He and I conspired to highlight three things that you might some things you might not know about John. First, his last book, Lincoln's Code, locates the beginning of the modern law of armed conflict in the Civil War and Reconstruction. So check it out. Second, he's soon going to be publishing a long-lost Reconstruction era manuscript on emergency powers, so some of the same issues. And third, he is working now on a book about the Garland Fund, not during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, but it's a philanthropic foundation whose leaders helped design the NAACP campaign against segregated schools. So that's a cool project. And today he's speaking on the Reconstruction Amendments as an ending. So thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Manisha. And thank you to all of the organizers. I'm really delighted to be here. And thank you, Nina, for that introduction. I am going to be talking about the Supreme Court and the unraveling of Reconstruction. And this is a standard account that no doubt all of you are familiar with. We have this idea of Reconstruction as America's second revolution. We have the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery. There was going to be, in Lincoln's words, a new birth of freedom. But according to standard wisdom, this is standard legal historical wisdom about the Supreme Court and Reconstruction, first we get a political abandonment of blacks. We get the Republican Party abandoning blacks in the wake of the 1876 disputed election. There's something that C. Vann Woodward made very popular, a notion called the Compromise of 1877. According to this deal, Republicans get control of the national economic policy, Democrats get home rule in the South, and at this point, Reconstruction is politically dead, according to the standard wisdom. And then the fatal constitutional blow comes in, issued by the Supreme Court with something called state action doctrine. Now, for those of you not familiar with state action doctrine, this is the rule, this is the constitutional doctrine that holds that the rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments are protected against the government only. And we get this from the text, no state shall abridge. So we get that prohibitory language, it's in the 14th Amendment, it's in the 15th Amendment, and the conventional view is that state action doctrine put unpunished Klan violence outside the reach of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And so with this conventional understanding of state action doctrine, makes perfect sense to understand that the Supreme Court handcuffed the federal government when it came to protecting blacks against the Klan, gave a green light to the Klan, and that this state action doctrine is attributed to two major Supreme Court decisions. The Cruikshank decision in 1876, where Klansmen walk free after a brutal, cold-blooded racial massacre, and then the 1883 case, the civil rights cases, which threw out the public accommodations provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And so this two-part standard story, we get political abandonment, then we get the Supreme Court coming in and consolidating that political abandonment with state action doctrine. Now, I want to destabilize that account. And the easiest way to do that in 15 minutes or 12 minutes, what I have left, is to point to two things. And both of these things have reference to voting rights. I'll leave the civil rights cases to the side for a second, but they have to do with voting rights. And the first thing to point to is the rebooting of voting rights prosecutions in the South between 1880 and 1885. At the height of voting rights prosecutions, it was 1883, 1884, there were about 900 to 1,000 voting rights prosecutions brought in the South, 1883, 1884. Then after the economic panic of 1873, those numbers plummeted. They went down to about 23. In 1880, we get a Republican president, James Garfield. Even after he was assassinated, Chester Arthur came in and continued these voting rights prosecutions, and they rebooted them. The numbers went up to about 200 per year during this 1880 to 1885 period. James Garfield, again, a centrist Republican in the Reconstruction Congresses, very committed to the Ku Klux Klan Act and those pieces of Reconstruction legislation. Garfield ran on a voting rights platform in 1880. He ran on this platform, he won very narrowly. So that's the first thing to point to. The second thing to point to is a Supreme Court decision in 1884. It's called Ex parte Yarbrough. Again, neither one of this case is not part of the canon of Reconstruction in the courts. Yarbrough was a decision that put Klansmen in jail under the 15th Amendment and these were private Klansmen. And it's not like this decision suddenly rebooted Reconstruction. It didn't. We can't overstate the political impact of this case, but the jurisprudential import of this case cannot be overstated, because we've got private Klansmen being sent to jail under, in part, the 15th Amendment, and on top of that, this is a unanimous court. It's a unanimous court. The decision is written by Samuel Miller, and so we've got a puzzle. It's like, what's happening? Both of these things are inconsistent with the conventional account. We can't explain them. If political will was dead, why is it that Garfield and Arthur are rebooting voting rights enforcement in the 1880s? If state action doctrine handcuffed the federal government when it came to prosecuting Klan violence, how was it that U.S. attorneys were able to prosecute these cases in the South in the first place in the early 1880s? And how on earth can we explain the Yarbrough decision with a unanimous decision sending Klansmen to jail and saying explicitly, and this is part of what I want to focus my remarks on, they're saying quite clearly that there's actually no state action predicate for throwing these Klansmen in jail under the 15th Amendment. This kind of seems very strange to modern eyes. But by pointing to these two things, the political will is still there, the jurisprudential voting rights theory is there. And the other thing to call attention to about Yarbrough is that it's happening after the civil rights cases. The civil rights cases is conventionally understood as this racist all the way down statement of the court, this elaboration of state action doctrine. And there's stuff in the opinion that was like, okay, yeah, we get Bradley's gratuitous racism in this case. He talks about blacks as the special favorite of the laws, very dismissive of public accommodation rights. But at the same time, the very next year, we get Yarbrough, a unanimous decision sending Klansmen to jail under the 15th Amendment. So the civil rights cases cannot be an all the way down abandonment. The other thing about the civil rights cases that's worth mentioning just briefly is that it throws out the public accommodations provisions, but in articulating state action doctrine, it points to the 1866 Civil Rights Act. This was the first civil rights legislation, and it protected property, contract, suing, testifying, race-based interferences in those things, and there was an enforcement provision that said that applied to private individuals. Very important, because what happened in the civil rights cases, and this is never part of the decision that gets excerpted in case books, in political science, in cultural studies, it's never part of the case books. The court says explicitly that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is valid 14th Amendment legislation. Not 13th Amendment legislation, which it was originally passed to enforce, but 14th Amendment legislation. And if you've got a piece of legislation that allows for the punishment of private people under the 14th Amendment, okay, this is another puzzle. What's going on here? And Bradley uses language like, well, if crimes, if ruffian violence is excused by the state, is shielded by the state, that seems to imply, and there's a lot of vocabulary in this decision, that state action doctrine actually does apply to systematic, unenforced, race-based violence. Not to public accommodations, but to race-based violence. State neglect formulas are never the basis for prosecutions. That's very important to recognize. But it's the voting rights theory that we do see put into practice. The other thing worth noting just about the civil rights cases, just for a second, is that in the wake of the civil rights cases, we get reporting on this decision in Republican newspapers that said, yeah, we like the outcome, you know, same position, no to public accommodation rights. But newspapers are seeing in the civil rights cases support for federal authority to punish race-based violence when that violence is not being punished. So we've got these centrist newspapers, both obviously racist and expressing this notion of racial caste, and at the same time saying violence committed with impunity is a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. And so lots of puzzling stuff is bubbling up. But like I said, I want to talk about this voting rights jurisprudence and what's happening in the 1880s. And I want to work backward in the sense that I want to talk about the theory of rights that the Supreme Court is articulating. In the Yarborough decision and in a prior decision, which also doesn't make it into the canon. It's a circuit court opinion in 1877. This is a decision called United States versus Butler. It comes out of South Carolina, one of the states with the most massive and unpunished Klan violence in the South. This is violence that comes out of the 1876 election. We've got a circuit decision written by Chief Justice Waite, the same author of the Cruikshank decision. What's notable about the Butler decision is that, again, it's a huge racial massacre, cold-blooded massacre, Ellington, South Carolina, got national coverage. So everybody knows about it. This isn't a small act of terror. This is a large act of terror, and it's getting national press coverage. What's distinctive about Butler, it happens after the election. I think this is important. Republicans are now back in charge. Waite gives us 12 pages of facts. In Cruikshank, if you're familiar with this case law, you could read the Cruikshank decision and have no idea that a racial massacre had occurred. You read Butler, and we get a 12-page description of this brutal violence. And you get from Chief Justice Waite a very clear statement that all you need to do and to punish somebody under the 15th Amendment is to show that there's a racial motive. That's it. And it looks like there's a very low threshold for showing a racial motive. Waite says explicitly you don't need to show state action, you don't need to show state neglect. So like, what's going on here? The same voting rights theory we see in Yarborough. So what's going on with this voting rights theory? How am I doing, Nina? Excellent. Okay, so let me lay out this rights distinction that the court uses to construct this voting rights theory. Because it's disappeared. We don't have it today anymore. And it's a distinction between what at the time were called declared rights. And for those of you who are familiar with Howard J. Graham's work on our declaratory 14th Amendment, declared rights, they're also called secured rights. These are rights that are conceptualized as having their source in nature, in God. They pre-exist the Constitution. But the Constitution secures them. So they don't have their existence in the Constitution, but the Constitution then protects them. There's another kind of right. It's called a created right, or a conferred right, or a granted right. Created, granted, conferred. These are the rights that actually have their source in the Constitution. The Constitution creates these rights. These are also rights that Congress creates. So we've got declared rights that have their source outside the document but are protected by the document, and created or conferred rights that have their source in the Constitution or in federal law. Now, the theory that, and it's Justice Bradley, and it's in his circuit opinion in Cruikshank. Again, we don't read circuit opinions anymore. His circuit opinion in Cruikshank, 1874, he is the one articulating this theory of rights. He says, if we've got a declared right, we have to let the state take the first shot at protecting these rights. The states have original jurisdiction. But if the states deny these rights, the federal government has corrective power and can come in and protect them. And Bradley explicitly in 1874 articulates this notion of state neglect, the failure to punish race-based violence as a form of state action. Okay, so Bradley says for secured rights, states have original jurisdiction, but if the states don't protect it, the feds come in and protect. This is state action doctrine. The other kind of right, created rights, conferred rights, the rights that have their source in the document, Bradley says the federal government has original jurisdiction over these rights. And that's because they're created by the federal government, the federal Constitution. The right to vote free from racial interference, is a right created by the 15th Amendment according to Bradley. So the right to vote is created by the states, but the right to vote free from racial interference is a right created by the 15th Amendment. By that logic, Bradley says, the federal government can come in and have original jurisdiction and protect these rights regardless of state action. So the upshot of this theory of rights, and Bradley wrestles a little bit with the text of the 15th Amendment. You actually see this in his circuit opinion. He says, well, you know, the 15th Amendment has the prohibitory language. According to that, we should let the state neglect theory, you know, structure the rights remedies distinction. But, he says, the 15th Amendment creates a right. And so that's what we're going to go with. And it's Bradley's circuit opinion that establishes this theory that says when it comes to 15th Amendment voting rights, you don't need to show state action, state neglect. The federal government can come in and protect it directly. And it's this theory of voting rights that survives. It survives even with the 1876 opinion in Cruikshank. And I can talk about this later if there are questions about it, but that 1876 opinion happens in the wake of the deepest depression of the times. It's known as the Great Depression. The court seems to be hedging. It's not committing itself to Bradley's theory, but it gives us the shorthand. It gives us the shorthand of Bradley's theory. And what's interesting about Bradley's 1874 opinion is that he circulated it widely. Everybody knew about this. He sent it to the cabinet. He sent it to Southern justices, Southern judges. He sent it to legal periodicals. Everybody knew about it. And the Supreme Court itself actually cites Bradley's 1874 opinion as the authoritative statement of Cruikshank. This is extraordinary. It's not the 1876 opinion that we all know about and is presented as standing for abandonment. It's actually the 1874 opinion that the Supreme Court itself during the 19th century cites as the authoritative expression. This is the theory that the Justice Department picks up and uses in the 1880s. This is the theory that the Yarborough decision explicitly endorses in 1884. And so even as Reconstruction is politically unraveling and the Republican Party is morphing, and Charles Calhoun's work on the Republican Party, the wings that survive, the upcoming wings that are associated with the corporate class, it makes sense that there's still a political wing that's attached to Reconstruction. They are taking the cues of the court. The court obviously cannot hold off the tidal wave of massive violence. The bureaucracy isn't there, the money isn't there, there's a depression, but taking a new look at the court's role in the unraveling of Reconstruction, I think, is something that the evidence gives us many, many, many compelling reasons to do. And so I imagine my time is up, and so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Hi, okay, so I would like to echo my thanks to Manisha Sinha for gathering us here today and to Juliet Kepsis for wonderful work on the arrangements. And this paper, as it happens, is a perfect kind of segue from Pam Brandwine's in the sense that I'm going to be talking about state action and the civil rights cases at the beginning of the paper anyway. I'm not talking about voting rights, and we can sort of discuss that disjuncture later, maybe. And also, I'll just say that the actual title I provided was a general title. The better title, the real title, should be Anti-Slavery Origins of State Action Doctrine. So it's a peculiarity of American life that the language of state power is central to some of the most important language in national civil rights history. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment begins by prohibiting states from abridging the privileges and immunities of citizens and continues on by telling states that they may not deprive persons of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny equal protection of laws. And in its immensely consequential 1883 decision, the civil rights cases, the Supreme Court explained what it thought this language did and didn't mean. The court overturned a federal law, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, for those who are following, prohibiting racial discrimination on public accommodations, so in inns, theaters, and on public conveyances. That law, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, according to the Supreme Court, that law exceeded Congress's power under the 14th Amendment. The amendment, Justice Joseph Bradley wrote, quote, nullifies and makes void all state legislation and state action of every kind which impairs certain individual rights. It is state action of a particular character that is prohibited, he said. But importantly, the amendment did not, quote, invest Congress with the power to legislate upon subjects which are within the domain of state legislation. So according to the court, the US government could not prohibit discrimination in inns, theaters, and public conveyances, since that form of discrimination was not a state action, but a private action done by companies that ran those public conveyances, restaurants, and so forth. The state action doctrine spelled out in the civil rights cases has been singularly frustrating and almost perverse feature in American constitutional law, leading to constitutional contortions like Congress's use of the Commerce Clause to outlaw discrimination in public accommodations in 1964, or lawyers' continuing efforts to mobilize the 13th Amendment, which has no state action language, against what John Marshall Harlan called, in his dissent, the badges and incidents of slavery. Pam Brandwein has argued that courts have read the state action doctrine too narrowly, and that Reconstruction-era Republicans actually believed that Congress could step in when states neglected to provide equal protection of the laws. And this state neglect theory importantly suggests that the federal government could hold private actors accountable for crimes when states failed to do that. But where did the 14th Amendment's critical state action language come from in the first place? And what did racist state action mean to the framers of the amendment? Most histories answer this question by talking about Congressman John Bingham and the year 1866. We know that Bingham, the author of most of Section 1, first introduced into the House a more sweeping amendment that would have directly empowered Congress to make laws necessary to secure individual rights in the states. Yet this version of the amendment garnered limited support, and Bingham went back to the drawing board in spring 1866 during the time that Congress was debating what became the first federal Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So then, when Thaddeus Stevens brought the 14th Amendment back into the House in May of 1866, it included the state action language, which many people viewed as a compromise, one of many compromises required to get the amendment through Congress, and of course the Republicans hoped ratified by the states. Bingham later said, in 1871, said that in the months between the first version and the second version of the amendment, he had studied constitutional law. He had discovered that John Marshall said, if you wanted to stop the states from doing something, you had to say so very clearly, and so he proposed clear prohibitions on the states accordingly. So that is the kind of familiar story of the sort of nitty-gritty of how that state action language came about. In this paper, I want to step outside this relatively narrow and probably familiar to many of us account of the 14th Amendment state action language. In my view, that account tends to yank the Reconstruction debates out of their historical context and emphasizes constitutional reasoning at the expense of real-world experience of the people who were taking action. I want to consider instead what information and experiences legislators were working with, and most precisely, what views on racist state action they brought into the critical year 1866. This paper draws on my larger book project, which traces Northern debates about the status of free African Americans from the early national period through the Civil War, and argues that those debates critically shaped federal Reconstruction policy. Today, I'm going to show that from the early 19th century through the Civil War, anti-slavery activists and politicians developed a special concern with racially discriminatory state laws across the country and sought to fight them both at the state and federal levels. In the states, they sought change largely through politics. If they could get their allies into office, racist state laws could be repealed. At the federal level, the issue was much more complicated. How could the United States establish a baseline of civil rights for all free people? That would likely mean Congress imposing a particular view of equal rights on all the states, something that was both politically unlikely and constitutionally dubious before the Civil War. The constitutional crisis of war afforded these folks an opportunity to translate some of their deeply held ideals and long-sought goals into federal policy. So I'll just talk a little bit first about what they did on the state, internal to a state level, and then what they try to do at the national level. First, at the state level, it's well known that the states of the Old Northwest came into the Union with anti-black laws on their books. Ohio was first to organize a territorial government and then a state, and its policies set the tone for other Northwest, or what we would now call Midwestern states. Fearful that black migrants, particularly from the slaveholding states on the other side of the Ohio River, would come into the state, would be paupers, would foment crime, or would otherwise disrupt the harmony of a white populace, so-called putative harmony. The state legislature in 1804 passed the first of a series of laws designed to make black migration and settlement more difficult. State laws demanded that free black people register and post bonds, and barred African Americans from testifying in cases involving white people. As Ohio developed a statewide system of public education, it also made a provision to exclude black children from public schools. But from the very beginning, people publicly opposed such laws. In the late 1810s, just to give one random example, but it's a very early one, an interesting one. In the late teens, for instance, a Quaker abolitionist named Charles Osborne published in his newspaper in Ohio an article by a black man writing under what was probably a pseudonym, William Blackmore, that sounded many of the themes that the movement for racial equality before the law would take shape in Ohio and elsewhere. Blackmore strongly condemned white prejudice, and he claimed, hopefully, I would say, that many of the white people themselves were beginning to understand that differences in skin color were merely external and meant little for how one should organize a society. Blackmore also invoked passages of the Bible that became central to political anti-slavery. God had made of one blood all nations of men, he insisted. White people in Ohio must begin to believe, quote, that we ought to do unto all men as we would wish them to do unto us. So I'm not going to go into the long and involved story of the ins and outs of the movement to repeal the black laws in Ohio and other Midwestern states, but suffice to say that to an extent that is rarely recognized by historians, the political anti-slavery movement, beginning with the Liberty Party, made black law repeal in all the Midwestern states a priority. Although black men were prohibited from voting in all those states, organized African Americans nonetheless contributed significantly in this movement. They petitioned state legislatures expressing their sense of those measures' injustice, demanding access to public schools, demanding equal access to courts, and so on. And prominent black men also often campaigned with Liberty Party candidates and Free Soil candidates. This movement succeeded first and most dramatically in Ohio, where a coalition of Democrats and Free Soilers in 1849 repealed most of the state's anti-black laws. But it's also important to realize that many white Midwesterners defended those racist laws with all the power they could muster, and they were in many ways on firm ground in defending them. They insisted that a state's sovereignty depended on its ability to safeguard public peace and good order, and that if the state assembly, their state legislature, decided that free African Americans as a group posed a threat to those ideals, they would be subject to special regulation. And it's also worth saying that according to mainstream constitutional interpretation, nothing about racially discriminatory laws violated the United States Constitution. The prevailing view was that the individual rights named in the Bill of Rights protected against federal incursions, but did not constrain the states. And moreover, a long history of poor law regulation, dating back to early modern England, held that local jurisdictions were entitled to regulate people as they saw fit in the name of public peace and good order. So these laws were unassailable, virtually unassailable, except through politics. So where they could, anti-slavery activists sought to extirpate such laws by getting people elected who would promise to repeal them. It was much more difficult to make the case against racist state laws at the federal level, both because the US government was controlled by slaveholding interests and because there was no straightforward argument that what the states were doing was unconstitutional. Still, anti-slavery activists did invoke the Constitution's original Privileges and Immunities Clause to make the argument. That clause, which is in Article 4 of the Constitution, stated that the citizens of each state were entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. The passage emphasized state citizenship and comity among states, but how citizenship in one state translated into privileges and immunities in another was entirely undefined. Of course, slave states had laws that, at their most punitive, subjected free African Americans from outside the state to sail into slavery if they couldn't produce satisfactory proof of their freedom. Anti-slavery activists and politicians insisted that in states like Massachusetts and New York in particular, free black people were state citizens with portable privileges, and that state laws that restricted their liberty, these would be southern state laws that restricted their liberty or threatened them with sale, violated the Privileges and Immunities Clause. In 1839, for instance, the Massachusetts legislature formally denounced those Southern laws, particularly as they applied to black sailors, but actually they denounced them more generally, and empowered the Massachusetts governor to spend public funds to rescue citizens of the state who were unfairly imprisoned in Southern jails. New York passed a similar law the next year, and it was actually under that law that the New York governor made sure that Solomon Northup got rescued later in the 1850s. But these activists had larger aspirations. Massachusetts people, having won significant victories in their home state, tried to persuade Congress to step in to curb these violations against the rights of free black Northerners in the southern states. And they made the argument that the southern state laws were unconstitutional according to, or violated the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Now, what resulted from their petitions to the US Congress in 1843 was a report from the Commerce Committee of the House of Representatives declaring that southern state laws impinging on the liberty of free black sailors in fact did violate the Constitution in 3 different ways, including that it violated the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But, the report lamented, the nation's legislature, the United States Congress, quote, seemed to have no means of affording relief or effecting repeal. They couldn't do anything. The problem of southern slave states' treatment of black sailors remained on the national agenda through the 1840s and 1850s, and Congress's powerlessness to ensure free black Northerners basic freedom to travel and work in other states continued to rankle activists and Republican politicians. Anti-slavery partisans remained in the minority in Congress until 1861, but where they could, they drew attention to the injustice of racist state action and demanded basic racial equality before the law. To give just one other example, in 1859, many Republicans opposed the admission of Oregon as a state on grounds that it had a constitutional clause prohibiting free blacks and mulattoes from settling in the state and owning land. Oregon statehood was approved anyway, even with that clause. At the same time, as Americans of the period well understood, once states were in the Union, they could do just about anything they wanted. So in the early 1850s, both Illinois and Indiana adopted laws prohibiting further migration of free African Americans into the states. Obviously, those states had gone in the opposite direction of Ohio, and also Michigan had really significantly diminished their anti-black laws. Anti-slavery activists continued to argue that exclusion of African Americans, flat out exclusion as opposed to regulation once they were in the state, violated the Constitution's Privileges and Immunities Clause. But again, that's a clause that relates to citizenship, right? So in both Illinois and Indiana, state courts upheld the black exclusion laws. And then in 1857, Justice Taney ruled in Dred Scott that even, and this is, by the way, a lesser, not the most frequently quoted aspect of this decision, Taney said that even if a state recognized a person as a citizen and endowed him with all his rights, its rights, that did not make the person a citizen of the United States, nor did it entitle the person to the privileges and immunities of a citizen in the other states. So Taney in that section is really addressing the problem of the extent to which free African Americans carry their rights from one state to another. And he's saying, no, you may be a citizen of New York, but that doesn't mean you'll get anything worthwhile when you're in South Carolina. So across the antebellum decades, a major political battle had developed between a cohort that condemned racist state laws and would like to bring federal power to bear on the problem if they could, and a cohort whose members largely opposed racial equality before the law and also were deeply committed to the idea that state governments ought to be able to decide for themselves. The congressional Republicans of 1865 and 66, they knew this history. They had lived it. When they looked south and saw the states under Johnson's Reconstruction policy passing racist black codes, what they saw in some ways was familiar to them. These politicians had been paying attention to racist state action for a very long time. In the winter of 1866, the very aptly named Andrew Jackson Rogers, a Democrat of New Jersey, recognized what was at stake in the possibility of a national prohibition on racist state action. The House of Representatives was discussing the Civil Rights Act, and Rogers directed a stream of historical questions at the House sponsor of the Civil Rights Act, who was James Wilson, a Republican from Iowa. And this is a long quote from Rogers, but I think it's really, it shows what was at stake for these people in making a federal check on state action around race. This is Jackson. Could Congress, before slavery was abolished in the country, have passed a law making all the free Negroes of the state citizens with all the rights of white citizens in defiance of the laws or police regulations of a state? Could Congress 20 years ago have passed an act providing that the Negroes in Virginia, in South Carolina, in Delaware, in New Jersey, and in all the other states of this union should have all the privileges and immunities of citizens of the several states? Could they have passed a law prohibiting a state from passing laws, as many did, that the testimony of a Negro should not be taken against a white man? Could they have passed a law annulling, for instance, the Constitution of Indiana, which prohibits a Negro from settling or owning property in that state? Or the law of Illinois, which prohibited a Negro from coming within the limits of that state? Could it have repealed all the laws of all the states which made a distinction between colored people and white, which existed in the laws of every state 20 years ago? Could it have legislated for free Negroes in the states then? If it had no constitutional power then, it has none now. And Rogers was really right. Congress likely could have done none of those things, and according to Rogers, it still couldn't. And this is in the moment when they're discussing the Civil Rights Act before they have passed the 14th Amendment, and certainly before the 14th Amendment was ratified. And in fact, John Bingham himself agreed with Rogers that under the current Constitution, which included the 13th Amendment but not the 14th, Congress had no such power. That was precisely why Republicans wanted to change the Constitution so the federal government could, for the first time, demand that the states repeal racist laws. So the language of state action certainly proved to be a liability, particularly after it was interpreted by a Supreme Court that refused to honestly confront the legacies of slavery, including violent white supremacy. But standing in the spring of 1866 and thinking about the decades of struggle against racist state laws that had preceded that moment and the futility until then of invoking federal power to create a baseline of civil rights, it's little wonder that Democrats like Andrew Jackson Rogers were really freaked out, and little wonder that most Republicans recognized the 14th Amendment's federal prohibition on unjust state action as a major accomplishment. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Manisha for organizing this terrific conference and Juliet for all the logistical help, UConn for its warm hospitality, and all of you for attending today, which I think is a testament to Manisha and Juliet and UConn's hospitality. This is a great audience, full house. The strengthening of the United States as a nation state emerges as an overarching theme in the legal decisions made during the 1860s. While some of these legal moments can be packaged together, you could link the 13th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, for instance. Some strands stand apart from the traditional focus of Reconstruction, maybe related chronologically or sparked by other events, but stand apart. A couple obvious points. The war's outcome maintains the territorial integrity of the Union, and it affirms the Union's perpetuity. And people at the time know that these determinations are being made, right? Either the Confederacy or the Union will win the war. And slavery gets eliminated, removing the one dispute so divisive it nearly tore apart the Union. And now the United States is unified within the free labor capitalist ideology. And this is one that people didn't realize at the time would get resolved until events progressed. What we see in the 1860s is the federal government exercising its power in a more vigorous way, not just in terms of prosecuting the war, but also with economic and then rights-related legislation, and there's no going back. If the pendulum before swung before Jefferson and Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, it now fluctuates on the side of a more vigorous federal government. Certainly not what we have today, but it's an important change nonetheless. And we often focus on Lincoln and executive power during wartime, but all three branches get invigorated as a result of the developments in the 1860s. For Congress, some of this activity is directly linked to wartime necessities. The Constitution allows Congress to raise and support armies, and conscription involved compelling people to risk their safety with military service. But arguments about the constitutionality of conscription don't focus on individual liberty arguments. They center on federalism. And Chief Justice Taney was so eager to address this issue, he actually wrote a draft opinion that said the federal government could call up state militia forces in times of emergency, but could not violate state sovereignty by drafting their members directly into the federal forces. And Taney never had the chance to issue his opinion because the Supreme Court never considered conscription during the Civil War. And where conscription altered federal-state relations as to military service, and it confirmed Congress's power to raise armies using coercion, on the other side came an increase in the federal duty to take care of its citizens, the pension system. But the Republican congressional majority also enacted legislation that promoted a more cohesive capitalist nation-state. And wartime necessities helped shape some, but not all elements of this Republican capitalist economic program. And these initiatives don't rely on any constitutional power that becomes available only as a result of the war. Congress enacts the first national income tax and establishes a bureaucracy to collect it. Congress creates a national bank system regulated by the federal government. And a stable currency of greenbacks that gets placed into circulation proves critical to promoting economic development because it ends easily forged state banknotes governed by state laws and corporate charters. And this is a point that Lincoln explicitly noted in his 1864 annual message. Congressional Republicans provided for a major internal improvement, constructing a transcontinental railroad, which helps bring the nation and its markets together. And we're going to hear after lunch discussion about what was going on in the West and consolidation of the West in a terrific panel. And they promoted free labor ideals of individual self-improvement and self-sufficiency by encouraging development of land west of the Mississippi and granting each state public land to sell for the benefit of higher education, the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act. And in veto messages, these acts had been before President Buchanan. And in veto messages, Buchanan had said both of these measures violated federalism and fell outside of congressional power. So this is a bigger moment than we realize. These are statutes that we look at and think are very mundane, but we don't realize that Buchanan actually vetoed both of them. It's also very easy to focus on texts and doctrine when talking about legal change, but we need to remember that laws affect people, individuals. Think about the laws that I just mentioned: conscription, finances, education, land. These are big items with a real impact on lives, creating new interactions with the federal government and the nation. Citizenship, a legal concept that defines rights and obligations, but also operates on a social and cultural level and helps define one's personal identity, undergoes a huge transformation, not just in the law at this time, but in people as well. And a nation-state needs citizens who support it and believe that they are a part of it. Wartime experiences certainly have a major impact on concepts of citizenship for white Americans, but I think some of the most profound changes in this regard came for black Union soldiers and sailors. And this personal component includes their families and the whole African American community. Black soldiers faced prejudice in the Army, but where slaves could not gather by law, black regiments now donned the same uniform and fought under the same flag as white units. Slaves likely never considered national allegiance while laboring in bondage, but now they fought under the United States colors. Flag presentation ceremonies honoring the soldiers of black regiments departing from northern cities identified them as national citizens despite the Dred Scott case that excluded them from national citizenship. General courts-martial, which addressed serious infractions, provided black soldiers with a surprising level of due process. They could object to members of the trial panel. They could have defense counsel. They could examine witnesses, including, if they didn't have defense counsel, by posing their own questions. They could testify. The Judge Advocate General's office reviewed proceedings to ensure procedural correctness. And many of these rights were not afforded to black civilians. So here's the United States military promulgating the concept of equality before the law regardless of race, and in the process shifting the experience most black soldiers previously had with the law, which was arbitrary rule under slavery, where owners and overseers were the law. To be fair, individual officers handled most infractions by black troops, and some of them could be very racist, but the War Department, as a policy, tried to enforce applying the Articles of War regardless of race. And this experience helped inform the post-war agenda for black people by emphasizing the concept of due process, that the rule of law could be used to protect the rights to which they aspired. We sometimes forget that it was very possible to have an end to slavery, but also a caste system written into the law. And instead, a colorblind citizenship is created by the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, even if these rights aren't always enjoyed in practice, which is something that we're going to be hearing about in tomorrow morning's panel. Now, by this point, you're wondering why a lawyer hasn't talked about the courts, especially when I said earlier all three branches get invigorated. And now is my chance. As of the Civil War, national citizenship existed as a vague concept. It left most of the rights and privileges today associated with national citizenship to be handled by the states, and the states could define those rights and privileges based on race and slave status and gender and whether someone was naturalized or native-born citizen. And black people are excluded from national citizenship altogether pursuant to Dred Scott. The 13th Amendment then ends slavery, but it doesn't define what freedom means, and in that context, Southern state legislatures enacted black codes, which offered one possible model. Some rights, but heavy restrictions at the same time, especially so as to prevent economic mobility. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first national civil rights legislation in U.S. history, directly responded to these black codes, and congressional Republicans used it to define national citizenship and associate certain rights associated with it. Opponents such as Andrew Johnson challenged the act on racist grounds and because the legislation revised, inappropriately in their mind, the federal and state government relationship. Because now, with the act, the federal government could interfere with a state's ability to discriminate between the races as it saw fit. Parts of the act are still in effect and used in plaintiffs and federal lawsuits to this day. And it defines all persons born in the United States as citizens regardless of race or color. Native Americans are excluded because their allegiance lie with tribal nation. And Section 1 further held that national citizens shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, give evidence, to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property as is enjoyed by white citizens. So the act granted citizens civil and economic rights fitting for a free labor capitalist market. You can't enforce a contract if you don't have access to the courts, for instance. And the act also authorized removing civil and criminal cases from state to federal court where litigants had trouble enforcing these rights in the state court. And this is a major expansion of federal court jurisdiction. And so to be clear, the act didn't abandon federalism, even as it recognized a greater role for the federal government in defining citizenship rights. It requires that within each state, laws concerning the rights enumerated must apply equally without race-based distinction. Republicans then proposed in June of 1866 what becomes the 14th Amendment, which finally defined in the Constitution that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, and ensured nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And note, it's any person, it's not just citizens. And this is something that the Supreme Court points out in the Yick-Wo case. The act and the amendment together strengthen the nation state by explicitly granting to the federal government the ability to define United States citizenship and the rights that afforded. And by 1870, an expansion in the executive branch, the Department of Justice, is meant to help enforce these rights by prosecuting groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Eventually, it's the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment that's used to dismantle segregation by state and local governments in cases such as Brown v. Board of Education. And the Equal Protection Clause applies to the federal government through the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. You don't need to apply the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause to the federal government because you already have that in the Fifth Amendment. It's the Equal Protection Clause that's used in cases such as U.S. v. Virginia, eliminating Virginia's ability to exclude women from VMI. It's the Due Process Clause that's used to apply selected provisions of the Bill of Rights to state governments and also to explicate the right to privacy. And at least Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch recently have shown an interest in reviving the Privileges and Immunities Clause as recently as 2019 in Timms v. Indiana. Where prior amendments dealt with the mechanics of the federal government or limited its authority, the 14th Amendment and the 13th and 15th Amendments expanded congressional authority to enforce, quote, by appropriate legislation. Now, the Supreme Court has held that the 14th Amendment doesn't give Congress unfettered power here. In City of Bourne v. Flores, 1997, the Supreme Court said it gets to decide what rights are protected by the amendment, and then Congress can pass legislation to enforce. It was revisiting a 1966 case which said Congress had broader power. Even the 13th Amendment has modern viability. I think the court would uphold using it to address sex trafficking, for instance. And where the 14th Amendment applies to state actors, legislation passed pursuant to the 13th Amendment can apply to anyone. And the Supreme Court has already said it could be used to address badges and incidents of slavery. Now I want to talk about one of the separate moments that I referred to in the beginning. Irish Americans involved in the Fenian movement sparked in the 1860s a parallel development that helped strengthen the United States as a nation state. The Fenians want to force Britain out of Ireland, some by trying to capture Canada for an exchange, others by agitating in the United Kingdom. And in late 1865, early 1866, and a few years after, Britain starts arresting hundreds of suspected Fenians, including Union veterans, some of whom claim to be naturalized U.S. citizens. Now, Britain and the United States had always asserted opposing positions as to expatriation rights. The idea that one could relinquish birthright citizenship without permission from one's native government and choose a different allegiance by naturalizing elsewhere. As of 1865, most of Europe still adhered to the doctrine of perpetual allegiance. Once you're born a subject, no act by the subject, not even naturalization abroad, can change that allegiance. And perpetual allegiance is what allowed Britain to justify naval impressment leading up to the War of 1812. So you say that you're a naturalized U.S. citizen, it's fine, we still consider you a British subject. So Britain accordingly considered these Irish Americans, including naturalized American citizens, as subjects, which means they're exposed to treason charges. And what's interesting is that within days of a Fenian invasion of Canada during the first week of June in 1866, on June 8th, Republican Senator William Pitt Fessenden inserted the phrase, or naturalized, into the 14th Amendment's first section. So that reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And the Senate adopt the revision without debate, the House assents, and ratification constitutionally affirm naturalized citizens as part of the people on equal terms as the native born. Because remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 remains silent about naturalized citizens. And so it's a fascinating moment when you're looking at the congressional globe, you see discussion about the 14th Amendment side by side with discussion about this latest invasion of Canada and the Fenian question. Okay. So this heightens the tension, and when you have Fenian trials in Britain, and you get rallies with thousands of Americans across the country talking about protecting rights for native and naturalized citizens, action to compel Britain to recognize expatriation rights, and affirming U.S. power to protect those it recognizes as citizens. This is a stark contrast to the nativism of the 1850s. And you have people talking in language of naturalized citizens standing on precisely the same footing as to the rights and duties. And if the United States allowed Britain to distinguish between American citizens based on where they were born, it ceded to power the power to alter, amend, impair, or destroy the Constitution and rights vested in it. And diplomatic pressure leads to resolution with Britain, and a bunch of other states to recognize expatriation rights. And so we see the United States speaking with a more powerful voice on the world stage, hints of what is to come. So some closing thoughts. Federalism is still very much alive. I mentioned the Civil Rights Act of 1866. When radical Republicans are talking about state suicide and treating the Confederacy as territories, Lincoln pocket vetoes the Wade Davis bill in July 1864 and explicitly says he has a concern about what these types of policies would do to federalism, and that's why he's in favor of a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. There's not an appetite to create a federal leviathan. We see some Republicans are concerned about the Freedmen's Bureau might be going too far, right? It gets chartered, but then understaffed and underfunded. And I'm not ignoring the other side of the coin. I talk about all these rights, but people don't always get to enjoy them when you have violent resistance with the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow. But that's a different talk, actually a different panel, terrific one, tomorrow morning. My focus today concerns how a number of legal developments in the 1860s converge and mutually reinforce the strengthening of the nation state. The United States maintains its territorial integrity and affirmed the perpetuity of the Union and moves on to consolidation of the West. The 13th Amendment eliminated the divisive issue and unified the country in free labor economics with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence at the core of its nationalism. And this process of abolishing slavery is done in national terms. The amendment ratification process is another reason why Lincoln wanted it done this way. The federal government becomes more active, whether we're looking at presidential power or congressional legislation or the Department of Justice or more assertive foreign policy, or in time the Supreme Court defining rights through the 14th Amendment. Economic legislation promoted capitalistic values and helped knit together the country and its markets. A railroad, a standard currency, an industrial power unleashed. And national citizenship gets defined in the law for the first time, with rights associated with it, with the federal government newly empowered to protect citizens at home and abroad, with naturalization placing foreign-born citizens on the same footing as those born on U.S. soil, and with the consensual and voluntary nature of national citizenship affirmed. And this new concept of this nation state becomes apparent even in the way reference is made to the United States in the Constitution. In 1787, it was, treason against the United States shall consist only of levying war against them, or in adhering to their enemies. And even in 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. I want you to look at the language of the 14th Amendment, which is always good language on which to close a talk. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And that goes on, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thanks to Manisha for putting this together and Juliet for running the show so well. It's especially thrilling as a legal historian to be here, I think. I think that there is no more exciting space to teach and write in legal history than Reconstruction. I think of the social history of Reconstruction, whether it's property rights or labor arrangements or family relations. These are all legal history topics. The political history of Reconstruction is a legal history topic. I think at heart, this is because the law is essentially an arrangement for resolving disagreements. And Reconstruction, as you all know better than I, is full of disagreements. It's a moment of flux and huge disagreement and contestation about what the country, from the lowest, most ordinary kinds of social relations to the things going on in Washington, D.C., where the country's disagreeing. So it's a real pleasure to think about these kinds of things. What I want to talk about today is what I think of as one of the last remaining holdouts of the Dunning School in the literature, and that is the idea that military authority in American constitutional law is antithetical to civil liberties and civil rights. And I want to talk about the implications of that remaining legacy for our thinking about the Reconstruction amendments. It's been useful to hold on to the idea of military authority as inimical to civil liberties and civil rights for all sorts of reasons, many of them good. Think of the last 2 decades, the ways in which historians and lawyers have marshaled arguments organized around the case of Ex parte Milligan, the military commissions case that immediately follows the Civil War in 1866. And the Milligan case has been extraordinarily valuable for a new generation of lawyers today, arguing against the disastrous military commissions at Guantanamo Bay since 2001. There are, though, I think, a number of works in the literature that are starting to push against this long-standing tradition. I think of the work of Greg Downs, who's here today, or Chandra Manning, Kate Mazur's work, maybe some pieces of my own book on the laws of armed conflict. And this summer, I'm going to publish a new contribution to what I think is an emerging reconsideration of the role of military authority during Reconstruction. At the end of his life, a man named Francis Lieber, who was an insider in the Lincoln administration, an expert on the laws of armed conflict, was writing a book. This is in the late 1860s and early 1870s. And he was writing a book that was a defense of the things that he had supported and that the Lincoln administration had supported during the course of the war. Things like the idea that emancipation could be done as a matter of military authority, or the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, especially in 1861 before Congress had sat, or the idea that land might be redistributed through military authority near the end of the war, or that military commissions might be a way of bringing justice to people who'd just been freed from slavery. And Lieber's manuscript is an effort in the wake of the Milligan case to defend the kinds of uses of military authority that the Lincoln administration had engaged in. Lieber dies in 1872 with the manuscript unfinished. His son, a man named Guido Norman Lieber, who becomes eventually Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Army, takes up the manuscript, tries to finish it. The son is not a theorist in the way the father was. He's also busy. He's a military lawyer. He's got other things to do. And so the manuscript is never finished. It's in half-written form in the National Archives in Washington. It ends up in the Philippines Judge Advocate General papers, misfiled, lost, until I encountered it a couple years ago, and this summer we'll be publishing an edited version of the manuscript. And so I thought I'd talk to you a little bit today about what's in that manuscript, the kinds of arguments it's engaged in, and what I think it might mean for our thinking about the Reconstruction amendments as not just the beginning of a new constitutional period in our history, but also as the ending for a certain form of authority that had been very valuable to the process of emancipation and its aftermath. So, what is this manuscript? The manuscript is a defense of the righteous use of the war authority by the Lincoln administration. It intervenes in many of the arguments that you heard Kate and Christian talking about from 1866 in particular, about what the source of federal authority to pass things like the Civil Rights Act or the Freedmen's Bureau might have been. It intervenes in those arguments and advances the idea that states, in the international law sense, have the authority necessarily to protect themselves. It's not an alienable authority. It just exists in the nature of being a state. Nothing in the Constitution, say the Liebers, could have alienated this authority to do what's necessary to protect the state. The argument that the Liebers make in this manuscript intervenes not just in the US constitutional debates, but also in an international set of arguments arising out of the British Empire and in uses of martial law in the British Empire to put down rebellions in places like Jamaica and in the Indian subcontinent. It intervenes in those emergency arguments as well, and it defends a fierce but bounded vision of what that necessity authority is. Fierce in the sense that the Liebers are defending the Lincoln administration. They're convinced that states have power to protect themselves, but bounded in the sense that they're rejecting the fiercest visions of the necessity authority coming out of those British Empire debates. The necessity power that they articulate is one in which states have the power to do what's reasonable to protect themselves. And the reasonableness, which we could talk about maybe in questions and answers if anybody's interested, is the constraint. It's built into the identity of the republic. Reasonableness is confined to the things that are consistent with the public reason and constitutional values of an existing regime. Now, in 1866 and the years thereafter, this necessity theory, see the Milligan case, is on the outs. And beginning with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, but then accelerating really in the 14th Amendment's ratification, it's an argument that's being displaced by the Reconstruction Amendment. So in this light, let's consider the 14th Amendment, and here are six ways in which the Reconstruction Amendments, and the 14th Amendment in particular, are helping to bring an end to the wartime power, the necessity power that the Liebers were defending. So one, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th Amendment in particular, are displacing the grasp of war and conquered territories ideas. That is, in 1866, those are the authorities that are brought forward to answer the question that Andrew Jackson Rogers, Congressman Andrew Jackson Rogers, is asking in the debates of 1866. And the answer that comes back is that the grasp of war permits Congress to continue to regulate in the rebel states of the South. The grasp of war and the idea that they're conquered territories become a necessity power rationale for congressional regulation. The Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, on the other hand, substitutes a new authority, a peacetime authority for Congress to regulate within certain bounds in those kinds of spaces. And that transition makes an important difference. Wartime powers had largely been what the Supreme Court might have called political questions. That is, questions that cases like the Prize cases from 1863 or the Vallandigham case from 1864 had taught the country that the Supreme Court would not intervene to regulate. The Supreme Court would let the executive branch or Congress battle it out in those kinds of spaces. Peacetime powers, on the other hand, were different. And since at least the case of Marbury against Madison decided in 1803, the US Supreme Court had made clear its commitment to policing the boundaries and constraints and limits of those kinds of authority. So the Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, as a displacement of the necessity authority, is a license for the Supreme Court to become a much more influential player in the course of Reconstruction and its aftermath. Second, the 14th Amendment contemplates on many accounts, premature end of military rule. For key drafters like Bingham, the general and open-ended features of Section 1 created a new federal constitutional power and also mark the end of the powers offered by the necessity idea that the Liebers are defending in their manuscript. Any number of African-American observers at the time observed what Martin Delany called disquieting effects of the transition from military authority to this new constitutional regime. And the 14th Amendment and its general terminology, the move to these peacetime powers, is part of that process. I think it's also true that the link between the 14th Amendment and the readmission of the rebel states and the way in which that readmission comes to turn on ratification of the 14th Amendment is also a third link between the Reconstruction Amendments and the end of this military authority. The 1867 Reconstruction Act in March makes ratification of the 14th Amendment necessary for readmission, and makes it just that more likely that the Congress that will result from that now includes readmitted rebel states, just that much more likely that Congress will not support powerful military action in the South. So that's 3 so far, 3 more to go. The 14th Amendment invests in federal district courts as opposed to military commissions. Milligan, the 1866 Military Commissions case, is at the heart of the Lieber's efforts in their manuscript. And the 14th Amendment and the enforcement acts that follow invest in the federal courts and in federal criminal prosecutions as against military commissions. And this now goes to some of Pam's story and her wonderful presentation. But the standard story, and now here I'm going to be conventional as opposed to Pam's innovative and cutting edge, but the conventional story here tells us the federal courts don't have the institutional capacity to do the work necessary to bring peace to parts of South Carolina and elsewhere that are ravaged by Klan violence, such that in 1872 and 73 in upcountry South Carolina, there are 1,200 indictments against Klan members. And the district court in South Carolina simply has no capacity to manage that kind of a problem. Military commissions might have, but the court is making it awfully hard to pursue military commissions. So by transitioning from military commissions to federal courts, the 14th Amendment has displaced the kind of institutional capacity that could have brought some kind of meaningful protection to the freed people. Two more. One, shaping the amendment. That is, the 14th Amendment structure itself reflects the transition from military authority to peacetime authority. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment had initially been contemplated as a radical disfranchisement of participants in the rebellion. People like Garfield observe that any such radical disfranchisement would have to be accompanied by continued military occupation. If 9 out of 10 Southerners aren't allowed to vote on Garfield's account, then the military occupation will have to continue. And so Section 3 becomes a much narrower disqualification of federal officials who'd been federal officials before the war, and the boldest forms of disfranchisement are abandoned. Last and most in the imagination of the 14th Amendment and the imagination that the 14th Amendment encourages, I think of my colleague Risa Goluboff at the University of Virginia, her account of Brown against Board of Education, and the way in which Brown in the 1950s captures a certain vision of the reform imagination. I think the 14th Amendment does something of the same. That is, Brown is a 14th Amendment case, but the amendment itself captures the imagination, becomes a way of thinking about what Reconstruction should be, and displaces other alternative forms and alternative paths. So here's our dilemma, I think, in thinking about the Reconstruction amendments, and the 14th Amendment in particular. It is the embodiment of the Civil War's great triumph. People like Frederick Douglass and others think of it as the culmination, the outcome, the vindication of a set of military processes. At the very same time, it brings an end to those military processes too. Now, one last observation about the kind of argument that I want to make here. I don't want to be making a causal argument. That is to say, the claim is not that the 14th Amendment intervenes exogenously in a set of processes and brings an end to military authority. Instead, I think what I want to make is a constitutive argument. That is to say, the 14th Amendment embodies and constitutes a world that is turning from a certain form of necessity power, the kind of necessity power the Liebers were championing, defending, and theorizing in the 1860s and 1870s. It embodies and constitutes a transition from those forms of authority on the one hand to a set of peacetime constitutional authorities on the other, which I want to suggest to you were not up to the job and would have had a great deal of difficulty in being up to the job of doing the work that something like Reconstruction would have required. Thank you.
All right, so I'm glad to call on people and take questions. Please tell us who you are and if you're addressing one particular panel or panelist or all of them.
Answered all questions.
Give them a few minutes. They'll think of good questions.
I thank all of y'all for starting this off so well. I have a super broad question, which is, how would
I guess I can start. Is this on? I think it's both. I mean, when Bradley was so contemptuous of the public accommodation rights, and he seemed almost, pissed off that there was even a claim to a public accommodation right. But at the same time, he's intervening on a prior discourse and debate over whether public accommodation rights should be conceived as part of the meaning of freedom. And there were many people who said it should. And Bradley and many centrist Republicans said no to that. But at the same time, it was Bradley who took a course to articulate actually a more radical theory of the 15th Amendment when he didn't have to. So when Bradley is saying, should we look at the text of the 15th Amendment and interpret it in a state neglect kind of way, or should we focus on the fact that it's creating a new right, he actually opts for the more robust theory of that amendment, and the court follows him on that. And so there's innovation that Bradley and the court are doing, in particular with the 15th Amendment, because if we go back and look at the Klan trials, Judge Hugh Bond, the folks who were doing the Klan trials in South and North Carolina are interpreting the 15th Amendment more in a state neglect kind of way. But Bradley's innovating when it comes to voting rights jurisprudence. And yet, the meaning of participation, I mean, if we think back to the Jackson era, the meaning of freedom and participation for white men without property really did come to include voting. And that was not extended to African Americans. I mean, the default setting came to be, well, freedom is civil rights defined by the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and voting rights were political rights. And yet, if we think back to the Jackson era, really political belonging for white men really did come to include voting rights. And so all of this stuff is going on. And I don't know if that's responsive.
I would say, one answer to your question, and what I think is that it was very, very new to make these kind of claims at the national level. And people who made kind of claims that when slavery existed, people who made claims that there was a baseline of individual rights, either to which all people were entitled, or even a baseline of individual rights to which all free people were entitled, even if you still allowed for slavery to exist. People claimed that that should be the case before the Civil War, but it was very, very far from being instantiated. And that's why, I am, the way that I'm writing about this presumes this kind of break of the Civil War, which allows all of this crazy stuff to happen. So I don't think that there would have been the kind of radical changes to the Constitution that there were absent a war. I mean, maybe if more and more kind of population development in the free states, I mean, maybe something eventually could have happened through peacetime processes, but it happened when it did because of the emergency and secession and the absence of a whole lot of states from Congress when all this was going on. So it was an imagination. It was in certain people's imaginations before the war, but it was completely impossible to make real until the war. And I think, I was just going back to, only a few people have written about kind of the political history of political and legal history of kind of anti-slavery origins of these amendments. And one was this guy, around Brown versus Board of Education, the 50s, people were writing about it. This guy, Jacobus Tenbrook. And he says at one point, and this is very present-minded for the 1950s history. And he says at one point, well, we all know that the purpose of government is to protect the freedom and rights of individuals. So that's the starting point. So this Brown v. Board is a realization of part of that vision of the central purpose of government. But of course, not of course, but in the 19th century, people did not agree that the central purpose of government was to protect the rights of individuals, nor do they agree with that now. And so I think we do have to kind of, remember that there are all kinds of other purposes of government that don't have to do with individual rights. And that's part of what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's the war that catalyzes this moment and creates such a moment of change. I mean, if you look at the removing property requirements for white voting and all that, that's a long process. That's something that takes place state by state over a long time. Here you have this massive change within a short period of time being conducted on a national level. But I think what's important to remember, and it's why we're all here, is just how confusing Reconstruction is and how many different voices you have. Some of the most egalitarian, some of the most awful, all going on at the same time. And I really like how you look at the 14th Amendment and say, law in general, and saying, this is a way that society tries to resolve disputes. And I think that's what's going on here, is trying to resolve all these voices, all these disputes, all these different competing arguments. But it's done in a much quicker way on a national level, as opposed to, waiting for, if you don't have the Civil War, do we get there using some kind of political process that takes decades? It's probably not going to look like this. And even some of these unexpected moments, right? I mean, I don't think you get the Civil Rights Act of 1866 if you don't have southern states saying, okay, we've ratified the 13th Amendment, there's no more slavery. Let's come up with some kind of caste system in the law so that we give the newly freed slaves some rights, but we make sure that there's no social mobility. Keep them out of trades and crafts so they can't make money, and they can't, move up and have social mobility and all that. So there's some of these unexpected moments like that. I don't think, in 1864, anyone is thinking, and the Republicans, okay, now we're going to have this, in a year or two, we're going to have this national citizenship statute. We're going to be defining rights on a federal level. Some of this stuff comes out of the exigencies of the time as Civil War and Reconstruction develop.
So we're about to run out of time. John, do you want to weigh in here? Or more, the importance?
Say a word, which
Yes,
is that,
please.
so Greg's question puts me in mind of what my reaction to Pam's brilliant presentation was, which was if the story of rights in the federal courts that you were telling, one in which the 15th Amendment does produce robust rights as against private violence in the American South, and the 14th Amendment does not. That was the story I heard you telling. It made me think that what we really might be interested in, the rights are just an outcropping of some much larger set of tectonic shifts. And here I thought probably it's the interest of the Republican Party that it is what's driving the two different rights stories. It's the Republican Party trying to manage its relationship to its southern constituencies, and the two different rights stories. I think one might want to explain by reference to those kinds of institutional questions that are just underneath the surface, which might move us away from rights. I guess that's my thought. We should move away from rights.
Yeah, can I just quickly? I mean, the story that really didn't come out here much is the state neglect interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, and that didn't come out in actual voting rights prosecutions. But I'm making the claim that we actually do see it in the text of the Cruikshank decision and the civil rights cases, and that way of thinking about rights, that everybody had the right to have their physical body protected when there is a race-based crime against them. That notion of protection by government, judges are seeing as longstanding, as existing in the antebellum era, but just never applied to blacks. And so there's a worldview that they're drawing on to interpret what it means to have the equal benefit of the law. That doesn't materialize suddenly after the war. They're taking it from an antebellum principle, but now they're applying it in ways that they never, ever could have imagined applying it before the war. And so I'd like to find a way of combining the absolute crucial, the break that the war produces, but the ways that worldviews and the ways of thinking about what it means to be a free person, and it's narrowed, right? It doesn't include things like public accommodations for many centrist Republicans, but protection from Klan violence when the states are just letting